Thank you very much for waiting. And first, who here likes history? And who's ready to get whiplash? Still some of you. I only ask because in this talk, I'm going to be launching you, who I consider my eager test pilots, through 7,850 years of board gaming history in a little over 60 minutes, taking us from the earliest known prehistoric board games of 6,000 BC right up through to the invention of your and my humble servant, cardboard. Along the way, there's going to be blood, there's going to be sex, and there will be jokes. But first, there's going to be a disclaimer, which is that I am not a historian. I have no background in academic history. I am a fan of history. That means that I wrote this for fun, and I will get things wrong. If during this talk I pronounce any names correctly, I assure you it is an accident. If someone next to you at some point starts bleeding from their ears, it's probably because they are a historian and I've made yet another assumption. At the end of this talk, I'm going to be name-checking the people who really deserve the credit, which is the authors of the books that I used during the researching of this talk. So you can go and do some further reading if you too are hooked on this dusty drug that I call the past. And with that, we are ready to begin. I'm going to need all of you to make some kind of wibbly time travel noise as we travel to the very start of our story. So, I want you to imagine right now that you are 8,000 years old, which I don't think is a big ask considering that's how old I feel after every SHUX. I want you to imagine you're living in one of the prehistoric settlements so beautifully depicted in this Google image search 3D render. Let me help you out a bit here though. So 6,000 BC is before pottery. It is before some smart aleck invented the wheel. It is in fact before the extinction of the saber-toothed tiger. Okay, though they probably don't live near you. Let's see if I can go back in slides. So what prehistory means really is a fancy word for saying it's before humans wrote anything down. But in this hardscrabble existence that you are living in, where you have really, frankly, probably not much food. Imagine that you are by the fire pit and you're skinning an animal or just thinking about how much your life sucks. But opposite you, in the semi-darkness, not a saber-toothed tiger, your sister or someone might be carving something that looks like this, okay? This is a Mancala board, and we find them in some of the earliest human settlements across the Middle East, in fact. Now, this is the earliest known kind of board game, but really it's a genre of board games. What Mancala is a series of games which have divots in the ground or in a board, perhaps carved from wood, and you can put seeds or shells in the holes and then move them, perhaps picking up 4 seeds in one hole of your color and moving them, dropping them along the way, kind of like an early version of backgammon. Now, I want you to dwell on this for a second. The instant that humans became advanced enough that we were able to strip just a tiny bit of free time from each punishing day, we started making games of chance and skill, and as we'll see in a few short 1,000 years, board games that tell stories. Now, we don't know the role that a community's Mancala set would have had in ancient humans, but what we can do is we can treat ourselves to the supposition that Mancala was perhaps a little bit magical, and there's a few different reasons for that, but if you look at Mancala as it's played in African societies today, which are of course a significantly, to undersell it, a significantly more advanced people, there are still superstitions. So in the Ugandan game of Omweso, which is a substantially complicated kind of Mancala, the game was used to determine how good of a king you'd be. This is just about 100 years ago. In much the same way that chess in Western societies, we like to think that determines how good of a general you are. But in the West African people of Yoruba, this is, even today, it's considered unlucky to play one of their games of Mancala at night because spirits will want to join in. Also, the Yoruba people will have several different kinds of Mancala board in their village. But if someone dies, it's considered unlucky to play Mancala on that person's favorite board because their spirit might want to join in. So really, it's impossible to imagine today the totemic significance that Mancala would have had, not just when this was a game in your village, but when this was games. And this is what delights me about ancient board games, the way that it's hard to see where the game ends and culture begins, and where culture ends and magic begins. If you've ever felt that board games have kind of a magic, magnetic pull, which is probably why a lot of you are here, I'm here to tell you that, yeah, there is a lot of magic in this hobby. So what you're looking at here is something very exciting. Even sounds like the name of a wizard, Astragalus, okay? These are knuckle bones of different animals. And we find them throughout what's called the cradle of civilization, where the first human cities started showing up around 5000 BC. And what Astragalus is, they're a form of divination, okay? Now, ancient humans, it's unfair to say that ancient humans love divination, because we still love divination today. As you know, the undying popularity of horoscopes and fortune cookies show. And different human societies have different kinds of divination. Here in America and also in Korea, hunters would throw handfuls of arrows in the air, and then how they fall determined the answer to your question. In some excellent Asian countries, there's something called kayadomancy, which is cracking open a coconut and reading the inside. But Astragalus is what we find in the Middle East. And the way that these knuckle bones work is you throw them in the air, and then how they fall, the side they fall on, or perhaps you could mark something in the ground and let them fall like you would almost a Ouija board, gives you your answer. Should we hunt north or south today? And you throw them and they fall. So what Astragalus are found as tools of the Sumerian priest class, which was an area of Mesopotamia, they are way too common to just be tools of priests. And in fact, we know that they were used for games as well. And in fact, we know this because Astragalus have been found with colored pebbles. So imagine that you've got your Astragalus and then you've got some pebbles with them as an extra board game component to play more complicated games. And in fact, we still play some of the Astragalus games today. If you know jacks, that game of bouncing a rubber ball and then picking up jacks, that's the game of Astragalus. It survived for 6,000 years. History is awesome. I'm going to try not to embarrass myself by getting too excited. But also, sometimes you would just throw them and the side they would fall on was the game. But what do board gamers do? We like to pimp out our games a little bit, especially if you don't have many of them. So people would start marking the sides of Astragalus with what they represented, so you didn't have to remember it. Kind of like we'd annotate a card with the rule. And they might start filing down the edges, and then just in a few short thousand years, they start to look like this. This is the story of the invention of dice. I think some of you probably saw that coming, but I was trying to hide it, because I think it is awesome. But let me be clear here. It's not that knucklebones were tools of communicating with the gods that over hundreds or thousands of years became simple tools to generate random numbers. Rather, humans have been rolling bones since there were bones, because for us, as an animal that thrives on pattern recognition, to toss an object or turn a card and get an unexpected result is magical. I'm going to skip forward in our timeline a little bit to 200 BC to talk about the Romans for just a moment, because even when you've got a civilization so advanced, I mean, the Romans were inventing sewers, concrete, even newspapers. But the Romans loved dice games, and they talked a lot about how the result that a dice gets is the will of the gods. They banged on about this all the time. But one of the things that historians still discuss, if you look at these dice, you can see that they're not cubes. Some of them are just way more likely to roll some results than others. And we do not know whether the Romans who were sometimes, by the way, buried with these dice. Ancient peoples were buried with their knuckle bones, which should be familiar to any of you who, when playing card games, don't like people to touch your deck or your dice. But we don't know, like, let's say you're the Roman who has those dice in the corner, which are just the worst. If they're less likely to roll that 5 on the bottom, we don't know if that Roman was like, it's just the will of the gods that it doesn't roll 5s, because they thought that if you roll the dice, it came up with whatever the gods thought. Or is that us, modern people, looking back on the Romans and going, they were crazy, religious? Did the Romans use it as a figure of speech as well? I don't know, but what I will tell you is we've barely moved on from this. Etsy has a roaring trade in dice prisons. Do you see what I'm saying? I went to school with somebody, no, sorry, I tell a lie, friend of a friend who played Warhammer, and when one of his dice misbehaved, he would put it in a microwave and make the other dice watch. Okay, so, again, you see what I'm saying? I'm talking about how magic was in the earliest board games, and magic never left, okay? So let's talk about Senet. Some people who are wrong say this is the earliest board game, but it's where we've arrived. This is about 3000 BC. The thing about Senet, this is an ancient Egyptian game, it's the earliest board game that we know how to play. Because bless the Egyptians, they wrote stuff down in the form of hieroglyphs. And there's this great story that, because Senet boards are found almost perfectly preserved in tombs, and these Egyptologists go into a tomb and there's some hieroglyphs and it's talking about passing and how if a person passes someone else, then... And Egyptologists didn't understand what it meant until one of them, who was probably a gamer, said, hang on, this is a manual. And we looked at Senet and went, oh my God, it's the rules for Senet. So what we've got here is a race game. It's a two-player race game. Egyptians would roll handfuls of sticks that would black on one side or dark on one side and light on the other. And that was a 1 or a 0, and you'd roll a handful to get a bunch of numbers, which, by the way, is a lovely way to roll dice. Like, we use dice a lot, but that stick thing, if you throw a handful of sticks, it just feels great. It's just difficult to pick them up. I'm getting distracted. Senet is a game where you roll your sticks, and then you move pieces a number of spaces, trying to sort of carry them all off. But we didn't just have written down the rule of the manual, by the way. The thing is, we like to think of hieroglyphs as very fancy, but they wrote comic strips as well. And this is a super seedy Egyptian comic strip that was written down by a laborer with some hieroglyphs that tells the story of a lion and a gazelle that play Senet, and then the lion wins, and as a result, he's able to take the gazelle to bed, which I think we can all agree is pretty hot. But we have another thing, a more serious thing that I'm going to talk about now. So, this was found on the wall of a tomb in Maya. This is an Egyptian queen. This is huge, by the way. This is like a wall, this picture. And I'm going to hold this for a second as I tell a different story. There's an interesting thing about Senet, okay? So the history of board games is necessarily the history of these games traveling the world, brought by invading armies, priestly missionaries, or most often mercantile traders. The story of chess, which we'll see in a second, is this grand transformative story of different cultures. They take chess and they change it, and then someone else takes it and changes it, and it travels around the world. Card games, when China invents playing cards in 1500, no, I forget, doesn't matter. We're not going to be telling that story. But when China invents playing cards, China and Japan weren't speaking like two bickering sort of parents. So playing cards went all the way to Europe, and then European traders brought them all the way to Japan. So they went around the world and back again. Senet barely left Egypt. And there's a few possibilities for this. It made it as far as like Cyprus, where they were, I mean, I'm exaggerating, but the point is that Senet was played for 3,000 years. When Alexander the Great invaded Egypt, people were still playing Senet 3,000 years after it was created. But it never left. Why? Well, there's the possibility that I like, which is that Senet was just a boring game. It was like kind of the earliest example of Monopoly, perhaps, where people played it, but, I don't know if you've noticed, we tend to think of Monopoly as a global thing, but they don't play it everywhere. I don't believe it's particularly popular in Asia, so it's only a curse in some places. And I like to imagine, the Egyptian traders taking papyrus and flax, and they're in the caravanserai, and they're spending the night. There's the Babylonians, and then the Egyptians go to the Babylonians and say, hey, do you want to play Senet? And the Babylonians are like, oh my God, no. But the truth is probably a little different. So when Senet started, those hieroglyphs that you see on the board weren't there at the beginning of Senet's lifespan. As we excavate later and later and later Senet boards, we find the hieroglyphs. And the hieroglyphs are religious hieroglyphs. So what I've got his name. What Egyptologist Peter Piccione has proposed is that Senet was something like a playable guide to the afterlife. And this is what Queen Nefertari here represents. Unusually for depictions of people playing Senet, she's playing alone. She's playing a solo game, which is bizarre unless you acknowledge that Senet had lessons to teach about Egyptian religion, which is perhaps why it never left Egypt, because it contained lessons that were only relevant to Egyptian beliefs. and practices. And once again, I am dumbfounded, as I always am when I read about board game history, by modern board game design principles. In this case, fragments of theme and storytelling augmenting game mechanics, having such appeal to humans that they're developed almost in parallel with the written word and books. Or, to put it another way, we're very proud now of how we add theme to board games. There was a board game that told a story 1,000 years before democracy existed. So next, I'm going to talk about a game that did make it out of Egypt, the top of the sort of ancient world BGG hotness. This is Three Men's Morris, which you might know as tic-tac-toe, or if you're from a civilized part of the world, noughts and crosses. I like that, that's right. That's what we call it in England, to clarify. But this, the earliest location that we found of this that survives is it was carved into a roof tile in about 1400 BC, presumably by a builder, almost around the birth of our solo board game fan, Queen Nefertari. And this traveled all over the world. As opposed to Senet, this reached the Philippines. The Romans were still playing it. 1,500 years later, the Romans took it to England. This is heartbreaking, right? But who played tic-tac-toe as a kid and was like, this is kind of a bad game? Yep, that's like all of you? Right. So, we're playing tic-tac-toe wrong. So it's kind of the version of how people play Monopoly without the auction rule, which actually makes it a game. The way tic-tac-toe is supposed to work is players take turn putting 3 stones, I should use its ancient name, 3 men's Morris, 3 stones, but once both players have put their 3 stones on the board, rather than placing more, you move them. And you move them until someone wins so you don't get that stalemate. But anyway, what's exciting about Three Men's Morris, it is an ancient world example of something that we all know, which is when you play board games, you want them to be bigger, right? Let me introduce you to a game that also emerged after this, Six Men's Morris. Or as I call it, tic-tac mofo. What we've got here, it's a game where you place more stones and have to draw longer lines. So it's a longer, heavier game. But what do you think, everybody? You think we can go bigger? Yeah, say hello to 9 Men's Morris. Do you think we can go bigger? 12 Men's Morris. You think we can go bigger? We can't, no. This is the largest one that I was able to find. But this is tragic. So the Romans, as the Romans conquered the world in self-defense, as historians like to say, they carved Morris boards wherever they went. And I've actually seen this practice. I've got some family friends in India, and I went to this ancient fort, and you can see board games carved into ancient structures, and it's genuinely breathtaking to stand above a 1,000-year-old carving and know that 1,000 years ago, a spearman was stood, bored out of his nut, and he carved a board. A fun thing about Romans is that they carved words as well when they carved boards. Really awesome Latin phrases like Victus labate, ludere nescis, delusa relocum. But it turns out that this was some of the earliest known instance of trash talking. Those last two, by the way, were carved into a board that was outside a tavern, if that makes sense. I've realized I forgot to tell a story about Senet. Senet is actually the oldest example of trash talking because if we skip all the way back to Senet, Senet had a hieroglyph that we found of 2 people, a conversation between 2 Senet players. Senet means passing in whatever ancient Egyptian language they were writing down, but passing. So one player say, oh, you're bad at Senet, and the reply is, you speak as one weak of tongue, for passing is mine, which I think is dope, and I think all trash talking should include the name of the game. For example, don't invade me, or this will be the twilight of your Imperium. I got loads of these, what are you doing? I'm the only Lord of Vegas here, etc. Anyway, the point is, and this is depressing, England was still playing Three Men's Morris 1,000 years after the Romans left. But I hate medieval perspective. It makes no sense, and I think it's creepy. But it's so amazing for depicting board games, where everything has to be vertical. Okay, where were we? Oh, okay, we're on to my favorite part. We're on to my favorite part. So we're going to skip from... We've got to about 0 BC now. The Romans are playing Three Men's Morris. I'm going to talk about the story of chess now. And if you take nothing away, I'm genuinely moved by how awesome this is. So, chess, if you didn't know, originated in India. And while this is a wooden board, because it's a modern replication of an ancient Indian game called Ashtapada, Indian board games don't survive because they made their boards on cloth, which is actually coming back in board games now. So yeah, and also Egyptians had made, when playing cards reached India, they made playing cards circular, like in skull. India is like it does not get any credit for the moves it made. Anyway, Ashtapada is a race game, kind of like all board games back then, but it was played on a very familiar looking 8x8 board. So this was, this was followed by a game called Chaturanga. This is just a nice picture I like of two Indian gods playing a board game, playing Ashtapada. You can see it's got the 8x8 board. Now, Chaturanga is what would become chess. And oh my God, researching this blew my mind because chess originated as something like chess combined with Root, the modern board game. Chess was originally a 4-player game in which everyone started with 8 pieces and players would form alliances of like, okay, me and I think this player, like the best player would choose the second best player or whatever. You form an alliance, you defeat the other 2 players around the board, and then at some point you have to turn on each other. But of course, that's a really interesting mechanic, because when do you turn on someone? Because probably whoever backstabs first, does this sound familiar, everybody? Whoever backstabs first is going to get an advantage. The next step for Chaturanga was to collapse. People, like the 4-player thing was kind of like Root. The 4-player thing was novel, but it didn't hang together as well as just a straight 2-player game. So they combined the forces. It was 2 players, and you'd start with 16 pieces, right? Which of course meant there were 2 kings. 2 kings. So you had the Raja, but then he got a minister. We wouldn't get a king and a queen for about another 1,000 years. But then, so that went high there. Then the game traveled along the Silk Road, how India traded with the rest of the world, to Persia. And Persians loved the game. They gave the pieces fixed starting positions, changed the Raja into a Shah, naturally, and created the terminology Shatmat, meaning literally, the king is defeated, which became the term checkmate. A lot of board game history is Egyptians going, I can't pronounce this, so I'm going to make something else up. The war elephant became a chariot or rock, which gives us the word rook. But it doesn't explain why chess looks so weird. So for that, we're going to talk about, we're now up to 600 AD, and then comes the creation of a hot new religion called Islam. Muslims invaded Persia. Muslims loved chess, but the Islamic Caliphate was against the creation of images of humans and animals. Perhaps you can see where this is going. So they said, okay, chess is great, but rather than looking like little people, maybe we can make them like abstract shapes of different heights with like weird circles and diamonds and stuff? Yeah. So then, then chess has something like a mental breakdown. Chess then reaches Europe, and for about 700 AD through the 12th century, we get a variety of chess variants that don't stick because people know that chess is cool, but it's kind of boring. So you get stuff like this, which is created in what is now Germany, but it's called courier chess. It's 13 squares wide. Then we get awesome stuff. So later in the 14th century, the Persians, who were still playing chess, developed Tamerlane chess, also known as Shatranj Kamil, or perfect chess, which adds, among other things, a giraffe. I do need some water. I'm just going to let you enjoy perfect chess for a second. So in a really early example of theme helping you to remember rules, I'm going to tell you how the giraffe moves now, and you're all going to go, oh my God, I'm never going to forget that. The giraffe moves like a knight, but rather than going up 1 and along 2, it goes up 1 and along 3. And it's like, yeah, of course it does. There's a whole menagerie of weird animals. Tamerlane chess also has pawns, which are like little versions of other pieces, and they can all be like, you can see like there's like an elephant pawn. So all of the pawns have the potential to become one of the other pieces if you get them to the end. But observant people among you will have noticed there's that weird little annex at the back. This is awesome. That in Tamerlane chess is known as the citadel, and if you can get your king into the opponent's citadel, kind of like slam dunking a basketball, the game is a draw. Because in Tamerlane chess, a stalemate is a loss for both players, which is interesting in terms of tournament scoring. Anyway, then later in the 15th and 16th century in Europe, you get a variety of powerful queens who take to the thrones in, I think, Russia and Spain for the first time. And with this idea that maybe the queens can be powerful, someone had the good idea of, what if there was a version of chess where the queen could move as far as she wanted? This variant became known as the Mad Queen's Game, and it's what we play today. So, yeah, we're playing Mad Queen's chess. Now, this is my favorite part of the talk. When chess made it to Japan, it became known as shogi, which is Japanese chess. The main thing in shogi that differentiates it from chess is if you get a piece into the back third of the board, it promotes. So every piece has the potential to become a different piece if it reaches the back third. So every piece kind of has two pieces. It's pretty cool, right? But shogi provides us with an example of something that we now know all too well because of Kickstarter, which is the idea that board games can sometimes get too big. We want them to get bigger. We want a 12 men's Morris, but 15's men's Morris doesn't hang around because it's too big. This next slide I'm going to show you was only unveiled recently in the last few decades because it was lost to time. But a few centuries ago, there was the invention of Taikyoku Shogi, or ultimate chess. A 36 by 36 board creates a total of 1,296 spaces. Each player has 402 pieces that move in 253 different ways. And of course, it's shogi, don't forget. So they all have different pieces on the other sides. Magnificently, Taikyoku Shogi has a Wikipedia page, and you can read about all the different pieces. There's definitely a version of this talk where I do a poker rap through all the pieces. Unfortunately, I have no musical talent. However, I'm likely to do this talk again. So if you do have a musical talent and wanted to write me a poker rap involving all those pieces, I will perform it next time I do this talk. Okay, so I'm just instead going to name some of my favorite pieces from Taikyoku Shogi. So we have some classics, like players have a knight and a king. Also, unexpectedly modern sounding stuff like bear soldier and wrestler. Then there's far out stuff. Players can each look forward to marshalling an enchanted badger, something called a cat sword, and no less than 16 different types of dragon, which when I was a kid reading the Dungeons and Dragons Monster Manual, we didn't have 16 types of dragon when I was a child. So now, because I've kind of in doing chess, skipped over some really important stuff in board game history that I'm now going to gloss over really quickly because it had to be mentioned. I'm going to gloss over the invention of snakes and ladders in India in a time which hopefully I wrote down. Nope. Okay, at some point, which was created as a demonstration of the Hindu concepts of karma. The reason there are more snakes than ladders, upward shoots on the snakes and ladders board is to show you that it was harder to be virtuous than it was to be evil. And then, of course, snakes and ladders was bastardized by the Western bloc. I mean, we took a lot of the religious and magical trappings out of a lot of board games. I'm going to gloss over the history of backgammon, or backgame, which has been around for so long that the ancient Greeks were talking about it. In fact, I will tell you one story about backgammon. The Greek historian Plutarch tells the story of Parysatis, an illegitimate daughter of a Persian emperor. And Parysatis' son was killed in battle, and she swore like an ancient Circe. In fact, by the way, if you like Game of Thrones, like George R.R. Martin has got nothing on actual history, which I know is a dweeby thing to say, but seriously, there are actual plot beats from Game of Thrones that actually happened. Anyway, Parysatis said, I'm going to kill everybody, and she did, with the exception of one eunuch who she couldn't kill because he was so well liked. And so Parysatis said, hey, she went to the king, and she said, let's play backgammon for money. And she lost, and she lost, and she lost, and she lost. She lost 1,000 gold darricks. And then finally she says, okay, she's drunk. Let's play one more time, but this time let's make it interesting. If I win, I get to kill the eunuch. And of course, then she beats the shit out of him. And then she not only kills the eunuch, she skins him, she puts him on a stake, and he dies looking at his own skin. So that's backgammon. As I said before, I'm going to gloss over the invention of playing cards, and I will show you, however, the earliest surviving playing card from China. And he's so cute! I love this. This could have been invented today. So instead, now we're going to talk about the printing press. Now at school I learned where it was invented in Germany in 1439. Johannes Gutenberg, through the invention of creation of pamphlets, was able to dismantle millennia-old power structures and blah, 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 blah. But, of course, what my history teachers didn't tell me is the printing press allowed us in Europe to manufacture board games for the first time. Europe was always going to make perhaps interesting board games, considering being a very Christian area, had a very complicated relationship to games and gambling. In fact, like a dark timeline, shut up and sit down. In 1452, a priest was able to deliver a sermon on the evils of gambling so convincing that the population of Nuremberg built a bonfire and burned 3,640 backgammon boards. So, what is this nation going to make now they're actually able to make board games? Well, some of you might be aware of a Switch game called Untitled Goose Game. Now, just to prove there is nothing new under the sun, the earliest board game manufactured by the printing press in, I believe, a date I was given that I don't quite believe is 1587. Say hello to the Royal Game of the Goose, aka the Game of the Goose, aka Titled Goose Game. Now, first off, this game sucks. It's a race game. Players roll dice and they move their piece from one all the way through the end. But it is a first. It is an invention. It is the first game with it's the first sort of geographical game because there are spaces like a bridge, there's a labyrinth, there's a jail, and if you land on those spaces, they all have their own rules. This is basically Talisman, all right? But also, for reasons I was quite literally unable to determine in my research, there's loads of geese. And if you land on a goose, then your movement is doubled. But what's great about the goose game is it's broken. The earliest game of the goose had a goose on space 9. So if you roll 2 dice and land on space 9, there's a goose, which doubles your move to space 18, where there's a goose, which doubles your move to space 27, where there's a goose, all the way through to, I should also mention, space 58, death. But yeah, if you roll a 9 on the first turn, you just get catapulted straight to the end and win before anyone else has taken a turn. But what's depressing about the Game of the Goose is that, it was played in Europe for something like 4 centuries. It is the most monstrous example of this Monopoly thing where people just keep playing this thing even though it's not good. But like Monopoly, the Game of the Goose got different versions as people try and sex it up, which gives us the Game of the Goose, but all the spaces are eggs. Or my favorite, the Game of the Goose, but we're going inside a goose. In this, players enter ominously through the eye of the goose, travel through its guts, go perilously close to the rectum, and then finally end the game, which symbolizes the goose laying an egg, or in fancier versions of the game, a golden egg. Game of the Goose, incidentally, 3.4 on Board Game Geek. It's also the only time I've seen the color coding of the rating be red. I didn't even know it did that. Okay, so, gosh, I need some more water. We're doing good, my time travelers. We've only got a few hundred years to go. Okay, designer, uncredited. So, while Europe's playing the Game of the Goose for a few hundred years and nothing interesting is happening, I'm going to take you on a little diversion. I'm going to tell you the story of the world's first casino. Woo! Now, I know some of you won't care about casinos. You will care about this one. So, this happened in Venice. The Venetian government were going spare because you have these rooms called Ridere? I forget. They were rooms called, they had a name, and the name, let me tell you, it was the Ridotti, which, according to gambling historian David Schwartz, probably comes from the verb ridurre, to reduce or make close. These were private rooms. Basically, nobles would have a room in their house. You'd come in, knock on the door, and then you'd go in and you'd gamble, and the nobles would take money from you, but it was untaxable. So eventually, Venice, the government of Venice said, fine! What if we do the gambling? What if we take one of the government-owned palaces and open a wing of it, and people can come in, and we do all the gambling? And it was the world's first casino, and it was creepy as balls. So what I love about the Ridotto is that it represents this, as yet unmatched pinnacle of class and luxury in table gaming, but also, it's weird. You see, casinos are fascinating reflections of us as humans because over centuries, they've been refined to strike at everything that caused the first ancient humans to throw knucklebones and be delighted by the result. Today, they are almost weaponized in their perfection. You might not know this, but casinos today are designed by this Bible, which includes notes on how tight the pattern of the carpet should be, so humans are slightly revolted, look up, but the lights are too bright, so they look down. So they force your eyes horizontally at the games. And there's obvious stuff like there's no clocks and windows. And the Ridotto nailed a lot of this. It was open 24/7. Check. No windows. Check. Creepy masks? People had to wear masks. Also, when you came in, there were stands selling refreshments that included wine, yeah, coffee, yeah, sausages? So you've shown up in your mask and you've got a sausage and you're inserting it under the mask and you probably can't see anything. Because one of the things we know about the Ridotto is that there was a government mandate that every table had to have 2 candles. And whether that was a minimum or a maximum, it was definitely super, super, super dark. But the best thing about the Ridotto is that all these people going around winning and losing fortunes couldn't be happy or sad. The Ridotto banned anyone going, oh, or yes, it was illegal. You get thrown out if you got excited. So if you roll the dice and lose the house, you would enter the Chamber of Sighs, which was an almost pitch dark room full of sofas that you could collapse on, and only in this room you go, ah! But the problem with that is while you're potentially crying at your lost home, there's probably someone having sex on the couch next to you, because this was where the sex workers of the Ridotto would go to ply their trades, in this pitch dark room. But there's a great quote from when Venice eventually closed the Ridotto, which comes to us from a French historian. By the way, one of the people who went to the Ridotto, Casanova. There's all kinds of sexy stuff in the Ridotto's 300 years history. But what we've got here, this is a quote from the wife of a French gambler. Moneylenders look sour as lemons. Shopkeepers can't sell a thing. Mask makers are starving. And the Bonobo noblemen, accustomed to dealing cards 10 hours a day, find their hands are withering away. Casinos would incidentally next open at hot springs, because there were a lot of people who, when they cared about fashion, they were ill, they would go to towns of hot springs, they would sit in the water, be bored out of their mind, and then they'd go to the casino. Casinos are pretty interesting in general, but I'm going to stop talking about casinos and instead go back to board games. Ooh. So, meanwhile, as we jump back to board games, this is 1759. This is a journey through Europe, the first map game. Okay, this is another first. And it was put out by a map company who were looking for other ways to sell maps. But you'll notice that crisscross is because it could be folded. This is the first sort of foldable board that we know of. And finally, of course, we've left the game of the goose. So let's see what the manual says. The first line of the manual of this game reads, "A journey through Europe is to be played in all respects like the game of the goose." There are some really fun rules. All the stuff on the left, by the way, is what happens if you land on different spaces, including, because this is a game made in Protestant England, the quote, "He who rests at space 48 at Rome, for kissing ye Pope's toe, shall be banished for his folly to space 4 in the cold island of Iceland and miss 3 turns." 3. Okay, right. Meanwhile, in France, which was generally ahead of England in board game stuff, this is 1791. This is the Jeu de la Révolution Française. And oh my God, it's the goose game again! This teaches the history of the French Revolution. And what's interesting about this, all the geese space are actually parliaments, but we cannot get away from this weird avian obsession with board game design. So they were the parliaments, but they were political cartoons that made the parliaments look like squawking birds. Will we break the gravity of these geese? Well, I don't know, hopefully soon. But this is what happened in very religious Europe in our board games in the 17th and 18th century. They had to be educational. The only way you could really get away with experimenting in board game design is if you were at least teaching people someone. And so this results in some amazing stuff. In 1815, again, leave these birds alone. But this is the Swan of Elegance. This is a game teaching moral scenes. But what we have here is the development of something new, at last, sort of. So it was a game designed to be played with parents and their kids. And the kids would land on a space, and then the parents would consult a pamphlet and read them something. So it's kinda, if we reach, like the first Dungeons and Dragons. Or as I call it, ethics and geese. To quote the slipcase of a different game, this I'm completely stealing wholesale from British historian Holly Nielsen, who actually has a short video on Shut Up and Sit Down's YouTube channel talking about Victorian games. But in that she says, referring to a different game but of the same style, the new game of emulation, all these sexy titles, these games would, quote, teach children to cheerfully exert themselves to obtain an honorary prize while being perfectly aware of the consequences of disgrace and naturally dread it. Okay, meanwhile, oh God, please make these games good eventually. In 1822, we get the novel and elegant game of the basket of fruit. Is this fun? No, it's about penitentiaries. Or to use its full name, the delicious game of the fruit basket, containing a literary treat for a party of juveniles and running over with choice subjects for their improvement and diversion in various familiar scenes connected to Old England, which is a bit of a mouthful, so from now I'm going to be using this acronym for it. Sadly, only the design and title were delicious, as the game dwelt mainly, as I say, on penitentiaries, but also trial by jury. So you land on a space. It's like, mother, what did I land on? Well, you landed on the Royal Institute of Blind People. Let me tell you about what it did. Oh God, okay, right, where are we at? Finally, right. Next, and the last board game I'm going to show you. This is the game of human life, and it is a stone's throw away from the invention of cardboard in 1850. And again, it's very similar to the Goose game, but it's relevant for a reason that I want to show you. So this is a race game that takes you through a life, which is a sort of step forward in terms of how abstract board games could be. We're not traveling geographically, but those board games that taught you history, now they're sort of simulating a life. So you would roll dice, and you travel through the 7 stages of life. The phases were infancy, youth, manhood, prime of life, sedate middle age, old age, decrepitude, and dotage. But every space was a different man, kind of like the world's most banal version of Pokemon. So you would land on a space, and it would I see this as like, you land on space 20, and it's like, oh, for this stage of my life, I was a baker. And then your friend's like, oh, I was a politician or whatever. So it kind of tells a story. But with the invention of cardboard, you can perhaps see how this game became the checkered game of life, which of course became, in later editions, the game of life. And so you can see just how far we've come. Thank you a lot, guys. That's been my talk. So a couple of things I want to shout out briefly. Tristan Donovan, It's All a Game, is fantastic. Tristan Donovan is an awesome author. In It's All a Game, which I probably use more than anything for this talk, he talks about various board games, including the history of Monopoly, Clue, all kinds of stuff. Tristan Donovan also, if you're interested, has a phenomenal book on the history of video games called Replay, which is both readable and exhaustive. Ian Livingstone and James Wallace, that shouldn't be Ian Living, that should be Ian Livingstone. They have a new book called Board Games in 100 Moves, 8,000 Years of Play. And then more edge case, but Catherine Perry Hargrave's A History of Playing Cards is more a collection of photography, but also a history of books. David Schwartz, Roll the Bones, A History of Gambling is pretty interesting, and special thanks to Holly Nielsen. Incidentally, there's lots of history I do want to do, so perhaps in future SHUXes, if you enjoyed this talk, there's going to be an opportunity in future for me to talk about things like the history of Magic the Gathering, the history of D&D, the history of, I got more up my sleeve, but yeah, thank you all very much for coming, and have a great show.